Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss the latest developments in the Middle East, as well as reflect on next week's one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks against Israel. We'll also cover a new private members bill in Canada that would effectively criminalize dissenting views on the historical experience of Indian residential schools. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
We sure have a lot to discuss. I thought I'd start, David, if it's okay with you, on what's presently happening in the Middle East. We're speaking a day or so after Iran's pretty massive ballistic missile attack against Israel, which, according to reports, was mostly unsuccessful. Where do we stand as of today, and where do we go next?
Well, I'd like to take from the shelf and tap on the casing of two terms we hear a lot: escalation and regional conflict. What do those terms mean? We have just had twice in 1 year a massive barrage from Iran across the airspace of Iraq and Jordan into Israel, hundreds of ballistic missiles and other technologies too, drones, cruise missiles.
Yes.
With light injuries, mercifully, but no credit to the Iranians for doing it. And they've done it twice in a year. And then you hear people say, well, we must avoid a regional war and we must avoid escalation. Well, if the largest back-to-back ballistic missile attack in history doesn't mean we have not already escalated, one that goes from one country to another across two other states' airspace, and we're not already in a regional war, what do those terms mean?
Yes.
I think one thing we have learned as we near this anniversary is it was always a regional war. This from the beginning was something that was not a territorial dispute on the front of what should be the exact borders of Gaza. This was always internationally funded, internationally based, internationally supported terrorist groups attacking across borders the sovereign state of Israel. I think we have more clarity on that. We've had a lot of suffering in the interim. And I wonder if one of the lessons of the past year was the escalation is going to happen whether you want it or not. So maybe take control of it and try to get to the end of it rather than prolonging the nightmare.
Well, it's a great segue to my next question, David, because as you say, Israel now faces the prospect of growing conflict on different flanks. What should the West, including the US, Canada, and others, do to support it in a moment of what I understand to be pretty significant peril?
Well, I think this question looks a little different on this side of the ballistic missile attack than before. At this point, the Iranians are making a habit of this. This is like every 6 months.
Yes.
They have to pay a significant price. Iran used to conduct a lot of terrorist operations on European and Western Hemisphere soil. Two terrible, atrocious bombings in Argentina in the early 1990s, an assassination in Berlin. And then at the culmination of this wave, Western governments did something. I don't know exactly what it was, but it must have hurt because the Iranians abruptly stopped. They stop when they pay a price. They don't stop when they pay no price. So they need to pay a price, and something that is important to them must be taken away from them. And how the different governments coordinate that, whether it's something visible like the oil refineries or the nuclear program, or something less visible like their presence in Syria, but they have to pay a price or this will continue. They are not doing good risk calculation.
Yes.
So someone's going to help them with the math. Someone must help them with the math.
David, I promised that I wouldn't ask you about last night's vice presidential debate because you've spent a lot of time thinking and talking and writing about it today, and I will abide by that promise. But permit me to follow up, because there is a line of thinking in Republican or conservative circles, foreign policy circles, as you no doubt know, that the U.S. needs to fundamentally change its foreign policy, shifting away from Europe, shifting away from the Middle East, and focusing on the geopolitical challenge in Asia. What does this week's ballistic missile defense and the past year tell us about that line of argument?
Well, I think I've used this analogy to you before. When I hear this argument, I always think it's like someone who says, I really want to assure the bank that I'm going to be able to meet my mortgage obligations. So what I'm going to do is default on the electric bill, default on the water bill, default on the credit card bill, and hoard all the money so the bank can see that I'm really ready to pay the mortgage. The bank wants to see that you're meeting your obligations, all of them. It
Yes.
is a it is a decreasingly large planet. And it is interconnected. So the idea that you can somehow impress the Chinese or muster the force to meet the Chinese in Asia while betraying allies all over the place, that the line of policy that is recommended by this school of thought teaches the Chinese a lesson. Under pressure, the Americans abandoned their friends. They've abandoned their friends in Europe. They've abandoned their friends in the Middle East. Put some more pressure on them, they'll abandon their friends in Asia too. And frankly, I don't believe the school of so-called thought really is a school of thought. I think it's a school of rationalization. Trump wants to abandon Ukraine for personal reasons. He has made this a party totem for reasons. Conformity and groupthink and a little bit of infatuation with Vladimir Putin among some social conservatives have made this a party totem. Um, but at the same time, the people who want to abandon Ukraine don't want to send a general signal, and they want to reassure the important forces in the Republican Party who would be upset at doing this to Taiwan and upset to do this to Israel. So you need some kind of structure of thought, no matter how stupid, to explain why you want to abandon Europe, but rest assured, Israel, this doesn't mean you. Rest assured, Taiwan, this doesn't mean you. You abandon one, you're abandoning everybody, obviously.
Moving on, at this point, David, what does success look like for Israel? How would you evaluate a good outcome in terms of Israel's geopolitical and security interests?
Oh, there are no good outcomes here. Look, the last chance for a good outcome was wrecked by Yasser Arafat 24 years ago. What a good outcome looks like is some kind of Palestinian Authority with many of the attributes of sovereignty, living side by side with Israel in a system of economic integration, people commuting back and forth to work, water, hydro, all the necessities of that's what success looks like.
Yes.
Okay, so that was vetoed 25 years ago, and we got the system of walls and barriers, which is, of course, economically irrational, humanly oppressive, ugly, an infringement on human freedom. Then this latest Hamas atrocity means that that's going to be whatever the wall was like before. The eventual wall is going to be much, much higher, and Hamasistan, Gaza will be much more closely scrutinized. There are no good outcomes here. It's just a terrible tragedy, and the suffering on the Palestinian side will be intense. Gaza will not be rebuilt fast. The loss of potential opportunity for everybody is just terrible. There are no good outcomes here. It's just a tragic, wasteful, horrible, no exit predicament. And the things you hear in Washington from the Biden administration, they have this vision that will, stand up some kind of substitute authority in Gaza. It'll be somehow linked to a reformed and decorrupted Palestinian Authority, and then the Arab states will pay for it. Well, if they can pull it off, good luck to them. But it sounds like a lot of wishful thinking. The best outcome here is that Iran gets a lesson of its life, and that without massive force, the Iranian nuclear program is halted in its tracks. That's the best outcome. And that we get some kind of stability between Israelis and Palestinians, and some kind of security system, and some kind of humanitarian. But it's not going to be good. It's just what Hamas did on October 7th committed Palestinians, Israelis, everybody to a path of tragedy from which I don't see any good escape at this point.
A common theme in our conversation since the immediate aftermath of October 7th has been the disappointing mushy middle where the Trudeau government has tended to position itself. And that hasn't changed in recent days, David. Although the Prime Minister has condemned Iran's attacks, him and the Foreign Affairs Minister have also been highly critical of Israel as it tries to defend itself. How do you assess the government's response, including the extent to which it's diverged from the Biden administration, which itself faces similar internal dynamics within its own political coalition?
Well, I think on this, the Trudeau government it looks ridiculous and pathetic. It looks like a lab rat that is getting zapped from two contradictory currents and is just scurrying around saying, we condemn the violence against Israel, zap. Okay, but we also condemn, and like, why are they bothering? At this point, the Trudeau government has brought Canada's foreign policy standing to such a low point that I'm not sure that anyone in the region even notices what Canada says about this or that. So maybe just give up the whole thing until you've built some equities where Canada has something useful to contribute. That Canada needs I mean, the Trudeau foreign policy is very clear. You do or say whatever is necessary to affect polls in swing ridings in the next 12 hours. And you don't worry if any of your statements are in any way consistent with or contradictory to those statements you made last 12 hours ago for your last set of immediate polling needs. Where Canada ought to be is first regenerating its capacity to be a good citizen in international terms, to be a respected ally, to have its voice heard in the councils of nations. And then it needs a foreign policy that is driven by international security concerns, not the swing riding needs of a decaying government.
Monday is the anniversary of October 7th, of course. David, we exchanged emails that morning, and we published your comments later that afternoon. And as I've said in different forums, including our biweekly conversation, it remains one of our most viewed pages over the 3.5 years or so that the Hub has been in existence. Why don't you reflect on the past year? What has it meant for Israel? What has it meant for America's leadership in the world? And what has surprised and disappointed you?
Well, I think from the beginning, I saw this as just something that had no good outcomes. That was just pure loss. I think that now. I mean, Israel has, in the past week, successfully damaged the power of Hezbollah, successfully damaged the credibility of the Iranian regime. That's a plus, I suppose, and not just for Israel, but for everyone in the region who is terrorized by Hezbollah and fearful of Iran. So that's something snatched from this colossal human ruin. The Biden administration, in general, I think they've managed this about as successfully as it's possible to do. They have been a loyal supporter of Israel. They have done their best to try to prevent worse outcomes from happening. Again, it's not clear to me what they mean by any of that. I suppose regional war means Iranians shooting rockets at the United Arab Emirates, but and American power is there to stop them from doing that, and it has been successful in stopping them from doing that. But as to American leadership in the world, I mean, we're just reminded how indispensable it is, and how this idea that the United States can withdraw from here but be credible over there. The planet isn't that big, and the United States is that big. So the United States has global responsibilities. Obviously, it doesn't have infinite resources. It has to have priorities, more here, less there. But it needs to think of global politics as a global system, and not as a set of rooms, one of which you can go into and one of which you can exit from.
Yeah, well said. Let's, if you'll permit me, transition the conversation to recently tabled legislation concerning speech with regards to Indian residential schools. It's a private member's bill, David, but what makes it notable is that both the Prime Minister and Attorney General have expressed openness to supporting it. You've been critical of this type of legislation in the past, and we'll get to that in a moment. But as a transition, what's the interrelationship between these two stories? How do you see the post-October 7th world and this legislation having similarities?
Well, there was an incident recently in Toronto where some Toronto teachers organized what they told parents was going to be participation in some kind of vigil or teach-in, but actually was a protest, and actually was not just about Canadian issues, but about the Middle East. And they brought the kids along to take part as basically the teachers' props in the protest. And although this was denied, there's a lot of contemporaneous email evidence that says it's true. The teachers told the students, those of you who are settlers, wear blue. After October 7th, some soul on the internet, some candid soul on the internet said, did you think decolonization just meant vibes? And I think it's important for Canadians to understand that the people who talk about decolonization, October 7th is what they mean. So I think, there's a lot of the project of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada I'm sympathetic to. I think Canada, like all countries, needs to face its history, both the good and the bad. And it needs to be candid about the history, make reparation to individuals where that's possible, as was done with Japanese Canadians, and where history has moved on and it's not possible to make reparations, at least tell an honest story and do honest memorialization. But I want to stress the word honest. You do not achieve truth and reconciliation on the back of untruth. And so if somebody does a metal detector test and finds disturbed earth and reports that there are graves with human remains, and there aren't graves and there aren't human remains, you do not achieve reconciliation by pretending otherwise. And what the reason for the pressure to criminalize contradictory statements on this question is because the story's falling apart. This is this, and so there's an effort here to say we told a story, we passed a resolution through Parliament accusing Canada of genocide. The story, there was not enough evidence at the time. The story is now almost certainly definitively exploded as completely false, and we're going to punish people for saying that, and that's how we're going to achieve reconciliation. And meanwhile, we're going to commit to this ideology where we are going to say that Canada was built on a founding sin. Of course, Canada is a European settler society. That is true. And everything you like about Canada, the democracy, the technology, everything that makes Canada a place to live, worth living in for all of its people, whatever their origins, is a product of that European settlement. It was a Stone Age society before. Now, there were human costs, there was human suffering, all human lives are precious, and all cultures have something to contribute to the onward progress of humanity. And in even cultures that are technologically backward, have spirituality and culture and artistic achievements, all of which are to be honored and cherished. But the idea of saying that 99% of Canadians are going to be treated as foreign invaders in their own country, the only country most of them have ever known, the only country their grandparents often ever knew. It's outrageous, and it has violence at the end point. The reason there has been no October 7th in Canada is because, well, cooler heads have prevailed, but the people who are justifying October 7th in Israel don't have an explanation as to why there shouldn't be an October 7th in Canada. This must all stop, and we have to rewind this. And we have to make it very clear when we do a land acknowledgement, we're doing history. We're not doing politics. That we're saying this is what was here once upon a time, and we remember it. We're not going to deny it. But this is not an IOU, and this is not a deed of property. That history is in the past. It had suffering. The suffering is to be remembered. Again, reparation is to be made to individuals, memorialization of groups, but this is not a deed of property. That Canada is what Canada is. It is a wonderful place to live for everybody. And the people who built it, who were settlers, they should be honored, not insulted.
Yeah, and so much insight there, and implicit in your answer is a sense of balance that one gets the sense is being lost these days. I should say, David, myself, I've been critical at times of conservatives who've been inclined, in my judgment, to minimize the in residential school experience. But as you say, legislation like the one proposed here strikes me as a case of steering the car way too far in the other direction. It effectively criminalizes any deviation from the notion that this was a genocide, which itself is an evolving claim. It used to be a cultural genocide, and now it's increasingly being characterized as an outright genocide. Why don't I just ask you to elaborate a bit on this sense of balance, which really has to govern the way we think and talk about our past, but as importantly, how we live together in the future?
Yeah. I think it has to, at different times, we need different lessons. And there may have been moments in the Canadian past where less self-congratulation was called for, more facing the dark passages was called for. But there's a moment, and it's now, when more pride is called for, more awareness of what was achieved was called for, less denigration of the people who built the country you enjoy. And when you're toppling statues of the country's first prime minister, without whom there wouldn't be a country at all, that you're not just making a comment about a person, you're making a comment on this whole joint enterprise called Canada. And it is an attack. And after the Middle Eastern October 7th, I think there's some hard questions that have to be asked to people who use this language. What do you mean? What is your principle that makes terrorism in Canada not justified? Yes. If you could get away with it, why wouldn't you do it? Because you're justifying it over there. Why isn't it justified over here?
That's a great point, David. One rarely hears any notion of a limiting principle when it comes to these types of ideas. We recently had former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney on the podcast to discuss, among other topics, the significant progress occurring in Canada's economy when it comes to Indigenous participation, for instance, in major resource projects. We seem to be at a moment where there's a lot of goodwill about making progress on Indigenous issues. Why then do you think we're seeing this kind of divisive legislation move now?
Well, I think the two relate. It is, I think there are important intellectual voices for whom any kind of progress refutes their idea about what the nature of Western society is. I mean, if what you believe is that Western society is irredeemably wicked, if you believe that people are prisoners of their birth, if you believe that racial strife is the most important fact, then when it begins to work and things are bubbling along and people are building projects and making money and you have any kind of improvement, that's a refutation. That's exactly the moment when you have to double down. And we have seen that in a lot of the discussions in the United States and in other places too. I mean, the goal should always be a common citizenship and equal rights for all, and where reparation is called for individuals or memorialization for groups, you do that, but you don't carve out perpetual special caste systems. And you especially don't do that when the motive for doing it is to disqualify or discredit or defame the society that is paying the bills for all of these programs.
Tremendous point, David. I know our listeners and viewers have really appreciated your insights about Canada's sense of shared citizenship and the practice of pluralism during these difficult times. Let's wrap up by reconnecting the dots between our two stories today and what they mean for Canada itself. How can we recommit ourselves to the notion of Canada as an unfinished yet worthy project of collective enterprise? How, in other words, do we overcome the forces of polarization and disunity?
Countries have been described, I think it was a Marxist scholar who coined the phrase, as imagined communities. That is really what do people, this is not a village where everyone is related, or these are not face-to-face communities. It's a matter of belief. But because we've never figured out a way to do democracy, which is the thing we really value, without a country to do the democracy. I mean, if the people are to rule, who are the people?
Yes.
And you need some definition. And that has meant, at least to this point in human history, creating a thing called a country or a state. It's always kind of arbitrary. But the people feel some connection, enough connection that the minority agrees to be outvoted by the majority peacefully and to yield power when outvoted. And that's on the basis of a set of beliefs that people have in their head. You attack those beliefs, and what you are doing, you're attacking the possibility of social peace. You're attacking the democratic idea because, again, maybe someday there'll be a democracy of Earth, but to date, the only way you've ever been able to do democracy is on the basis of nationhood.
Great insights as always, David. I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to speaking in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.